I never wanted to be at war with my neighbors. When Mark and I bought our home in Oakridge Estates 3 years ago, I was hopeful. After years of apartment living, we'd finally found a place where our son Ethan could have a yard, where he could feel safe exploring the outdoors in his own way. The house was perfect, a modest ranch-style home on a quarter-acre lot, with mature trees and enough space to create a garden. "It's going to be great for Ethan," Mark had said as we signed the closing paperwork. "He needs this consistency, this security." He was right. Ethan, our 9-year-old son with autism, thrived on routine and struggled with transitions. The constant moves from one rental to another had been hard on him. But here, in our own home, he could finally feel settled. What we hadn't counted on was the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association, and particularly its iron-fisted board. My name is Diana Chen, and I never expected to become public enemy #1 of the Oakridge Estates HOA over a sensory garden. It started innocently enough. Ethan's occupational therapist suggested creating a small sensory garden, a space with different textures, colors, and features that would help with his sensory integration challenges. After researching extensively, I designed a corner of our backyard with wind chimes, colorful flowers, textured stepping stones, and a small water feature. Nothing outlandish, just a thoughtfully arranged space where Ethan could explore different sensory experiences safely. The change in him was remarkable. He spent hours in the garden, running his fingers through the different plants, listening to the wind chimes, watching the water trickle over smooth stones. For the first time, he had a place that was entirely his, designed specifically for his needs. Then came the first letter from the HOA. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have installed unauthorized landscaping features, including but not limited to non-approved water features, wind chimes, which violate noise ordinances, and plantings that do not conform to the approved landscaping palette for Oakridge Estates. Please remove these violations within 14 days or face a fine of $100 per day until compliance is achieved. Regards, Oakridge Estates HOA Board." I was stunned. The sensory garden was in our backyard, barely visible from the street. The wind chimes were small and gentle, nothing that could possibly disturb neighbors. And I had specifically chosen plants that were drought-resistant and well-suited to our climate. Mark suggested we attend the next HOA meeting to explain the situation. Surely once they understood the purpose of the garden, they would make an exception. How naive we were. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with uncomfortable folding chairs arranged in perfect rows. About 20 homeowners attended, most looking as if they'd rather be anywhere else. At the front sat the HOA board. Diane Whitfield, the president, a woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a perpetual expression of disapproval. Robert Chambers, the vice president, a retired corporate lawyer who approached HOA bylaws with the same intensity others might approach constitutional law. Margaret Peterson, the treasurer, who rarely spoke but whose tight-lipped nods reinforced every one of Diane's pronouncements, and Stephen Adams, the secretary, who seemed to exist solely to document other people's transgressions. When public comments were opened, I nervously approached the microphone. "Good evening," I began. "My name is Diana Chen from 1472 Oakridge Drive. I'm here about the violation notice regarding our backyard sensory garden." Before I could continue, Diane interrupted. "Ah yes, the Chen property. Multiple violations noted." "Actually, that's what I wanted to explain," I pressed on. "The garden was created for my son, who has autism. It's a therapeutic space designed by his occupational therapist to help with his sensory processing challenges." I proceeded to explain the purpose of each element, how the different textures helped with tactile sensitivity, how the gentle sounds provided auditory regulation, how the colors and movement helped him focus and calm himself when overwhelmed. When I finished, the room was quiet. I dared to hope my explanation had made an impact. Then Robert Chambers cleared his throat. "While we sympathize with your situation, Mrs. Chen, the HOA bylaws are clear. Section 7, Paragraph 3 explicitly states that all landscaping must adhere to the approved palette and design guidelines. No exceptions are provided for personal circumstances." "But this is a medical necessity," Mark interjected from his seat. "Surely there's room for reasonable accommodation." "The board is not qualified to evaluate medical claims," Diane replied dismissively. and opening the door to exceptions would create a slippery slope. Next, someone will want a trampoline for their child's physical therapy or a bright purple door for their visual impairment. The way she used air quotes around medical terms made my blood boil. Furthermore, she continued, several neighbors have complained about the unsightly appearance of your yard. Oakridge Estates has standards to maintain, property values to protect. From the corner of my eye, I saw Patricia and Gerald Hoffman, our next-door neighbors, nodding vigorously. They had never once asked about the garden or expressed concerns directly to us. Instead, they'd gone straight to the HOA with complaints. The board's decision stands, Diane concluded. Remove the non-compliant elements within the timeframe provided, or face the prescribed fines. We left the meeting defeated but determined to find a compromise. Over the next week, I researched HOA laws, looking for precedents where medical accommodations had been granted. I compiled a detailed proposal, including a letter from Ethan's doctor and therapist explaining the medical necessity of the sensory garden, along with modifications we were willing to make to address aesthetic concerns. The board rejected it without discussion. The fines began accumulating. $100 per day became $700 per week. We tried to shield Ethan from our stress, but he sensed something was wrong, especially when we had to tell him he couldn't use his garden while we discussed things with the neighbors. His meltdowns returned, worse than before, having experienced the relief the sensory garden provided. Its sudden inaccessibility was even more distressing for him. After a month, our fines had reached $3,000, money we absolutely could not afford to pay. We received another letter, this one threatening a lion on our property if the fines weren't paid and the violations cleared. In desperation, I reached out to a local advocacy group for families with special needs children. They connected us with a lawyer who specialized in disability accommodation cases, Alexandra Rivera. This is clear discrimination, Alexandra said after reviewing our documentation. The Fair Housing Act requires reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities. Your son's sensory garden absolutely qualifies. She sent a formal legal letter to the HOA board, outlining the relevant laws and demanding that they withdraw the violation notices and fines and allow the sensory garden to remain. The board's response was to hire their own attorney and double down. They claimed that enforcement of aesthetic standards was within their rights, that the accommodations requested were not reasonable, and that we have failed to seek proper approval before installation. The fines continued to accumulate: $5,000, $7,000, $10,000. Meanwhile, Ethan's condition deteriorated. Without his sensory space, he struggled to regulate his emotions. His progress in therapy stalled. He began having trouble at school again. Watching our son suffer while fighting this senseless battle was the hardest thing we'd ever experienced. Just when things seemed bleakest, an unexpected opportunity appeared. Mark's company had been acquired by a larger firm, and he was offered a substantial promotion that included a significant signing bonus and stock options, far more money than we'd ever had at our disposal before. The catch? The new position wouldn't start for 6 months. It's enough to pay off the fines and still have a cushion, Mark said as we discussed the offer over tea one night after Ethan was asleep. But I don't want to give those horrible people a dime if we can avoid it. Me neither, I agreed. But I also don't want to lose our home over this. We were still weighing our options when I received a call from Benjamin Wright, an older gentleman who introduced himself as a real estate investor. Mrs. Chen, I understand you're having some trouble with the Oakridge Estates HOA, he said after introducing himself. I was immediately suspicious. How did you hear about that? I make it my business to know about HOA disputes in the areas where I invest, he explained, particularly when they involve potential Fair Housing Act violations. I've been watching the Oakridge board for some time. They have quite a history of selective enforcement. He went on to explain that he specialized in acquiring properties in HOA communities with problematic boards. Sometimes he bought individual homes from owners being harassed. Sometimes he acquired multiple properties. In rare cases, when the situation was egregious enough, he looked at more comprehensive solutions. I'd like to meet with you and your husband to discuss a possible alternative to your current predicament, he said. No obligation, just a conversation. Intrigued but cautious, we agreed to meet him for coffee the following day. Benjamin turned out to be a distinguished man in his 70s, with kind eyes and a methodical way of speaking that immediately put us at ease. 20 years ago, my daughter and her wife faced similar discrimination from their HOA, he explained after we'd exchanged pleasantries. They wanted to build a wheelchair ramp for my daughter's wife, who had multiple sclerosis. The HOA refused, citing aesthetic concerns. By the time the legal battle was over, her condition had deteriorated so severely that they had to move anyway. His expression darkened with a memory. I made a promise then that I would find ways to fight back against HOA overreach. I've spent the past 2 decades doing exactly that. He opened his laptop and showed us documentation of Oakridge Estates history, selective enforcement against families of color, denials of reasonable accommodation requests, aggressive pursuit of trivial violations while ignoring major issues with board members' properties. What I'm proposing is unusual, Benjamin admitted. But given the timing of your husband's new position and the particularly egregious nature of this board's behavior, I think it could work. His plan was both simple and audacious. He would purchase our home for well above market value, giving us enough money to relocate temporarily. Then, using his investment company, he would systematically acquire properties throughout Oakridge Estates, focusing on homes that came up for sale and owners who had their own grievances with the HOA. Once I control enough properties, I can force changes to the board, he explained. But I need a partner on the inside, someone who understands what's at stake and who has personal experience with the board's misconduct. You want us to stay and fight, I realized. Eventually, yes. But first, I want you to leave, just for a few months, while I begin acquisitions. The board will think they've won. That's when they'll be most vulnerable. It was risky, complicated, potentially messy. But as Mark and I discussed it that night, we realized it also offered something we desperately needed. A chance for justice, not just for Ethan, but for every homeowner who had been bullied by the Oakridge HOA. What about Ethan? I worried. Another move, even a temporary one, will be hard on him. We'll make it an adventure, Mark said. We could rent that cabin by the lake he loved so much when we visited last summer. It'll be a vacation, not a move. And we can build him an even better sensory garden there, with no one to tell us we can't. The plan was set in motion. Benjamin purchased our home, allowing us to leave with dignity rather than under the cloud of eviction. We told neighbors we decided to sell rather than continue fighting the HOA. The board was predictably smug about our departure. Some people simply aren't suited to living in a community with standards. I overheard Diane telling Patricia Hoffman as we loaded the last of our boxes into the moving truck. For the next 4 months, we lived in the lakeside cabin, created a wonderful sensory space for Ethan, and watched from afar as Benjamin's plan unfolded. Through his investment company, Fairview Properties, he quietly acquired homes throughout Oakridge Estates, 17 properties in total, including 3 on the street where the board members lived. Meanwhile, Alexandra Rivera filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development regarding the HOA's Fair Housing Act violations. Not just in our case, but in several others she had documented. The investigation brought unwanted scrutiny to the board's practices. When Benjamin felt the time was right, he made his move, offering to purchase the entire subdivision from the developer who still owned the common areas and controlled several undeveloped lots. Faced with mounting legal issues and the prospect of a difficult fight with Benjamin's resources, the developer agreed to sell. And just like that, Fairview Properties became the majority stakeholder in Oakridge Estates. The news broke at an emergency HOA meeting called by Diane Whitfield. The clubhouse was packed, residents murmuring anxiously about what this change in ownership might mean for their community. This is unprecedented, Diane declared, her usual composure cracking slightly. We're investigating all legal options to protect our community standards. Actually, Benjamin said, rising from his seat at the back of the room, as the new owner of the common properties and the majority stakeholder in the HOA, I've already begun implementing changes. He introduced himself to the stunned audience and outlined his plans. A complete review of the HOA bylaws with input from all homeowners. An independent audit of the HOA's finances. And most significantly, an immediate suspension of all current violation notices pending review by a newly appointed compliance committee. Effective immediately, Benjamin announced, I am dissolving the current HOA board. An interim board will be appointed until proper elections can be held in accordance with state law. The uproar was immediate. Diane, Robert, and the other board members protested vehemently, threatening lawsuits and injunctions. But Benjamin's legal position was unassailable. He had done everything by the book. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Benjamin approached the former board members with a stack of folders. These contained detailed reports of your selective enforcement, financial mismanagement, and potential legal violations. He'd informed them calmly. I suggest you accept this transition gracefully. 2 weeks later, we moved back into our home. The for sale sign came down, replaced by a welcome home banner made by our supporters in the neighborhood. And there were many, we discovered, who had their own stories of HOA harassment. Benjamin had appointed an interim board consisting of homeowners from diverse backgrounds, including a disability rights advocate, an experienced property manager, and a retired judge. Their first official act was to approve our sensory garden and dismiss all fines that had been levied against us. Ethan was overjoyed to return to his special place, which we immediately began restoring and enhancing. The neighborhood children, curious about this garden that had caused so much controversy, started asking if they could visit. With Ethan's permission, we began hosting small groups, explaining the purpose of each element and how it helped him. To our surprise, many of the children found the sensory activities calming and fun. It wasn't long before other families began incorporating sensory elements into their own yards, creating a network of inclusive spaces throughout the neighborhood. One morning, about a month after our return, I was working in the front yard when a hesitant voice called my name. I looked up to see Patricia Hoffman, our former neighbor who had been one of our most vocal critics. "Diana," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I heard about your son's garden, about why you created it." I straightened up, brushing soil from my hands. "Yes." "I didn't understand before," she admitted. "No one explained that it was for his medical needs. I just thought you were ignoring the rules everyone else had to follow." "You could have asked," I pointed out, not ready to offer easy forgiveness. "Instead of reporting us to the HOA." She nodded, looking genuinely contrite. "You're right, I should have. That's why I'm here now, to ask if my grandson could visit your sensory garden sometime. He's been diagnosed with sensory processing disorder, and his mother read about how helpful your garden was for your son." The irony was almost too much. The garden you tried to have destroyed might help your grandson. Patricia winced. "I deserve that. And I understand if you say no, but I'm trying to learn from my mistakes." I thought about Ethan, about how much the garden had helped him, about how isolating it can be for families dealing with invisible disabilities. "Bring him on Saturday," I said finally. "Ethan will be happy to show him around." Patricia's visit marked the beginning of a remarkable transformation in Oakridge Estates. The interim board, with Benjamin's guidance, completely rewrote the HOA bylaws, focusing on necessary maintenance standards while allowing for personal expression and reasonable accommodations. The overly restrictive aesthetic guidelines were replaced with broader parameters that emphasized safety and general upkeep rather than rigid conformity. People can change, I reminded myself. Sometimes they just need their perspectives challenged. The most dramatic encounter, however, came 6 months after our return. Surprisingly, some of our most determined opponents became allies in this new vision for the community. Robert Chambers, the former vice president, approached me at a community meeting 3 months after the board change. "Mrs. Chen," he began formally, "I owe you an apology. I was so focused on rules and property values that I lost sight of what makes a community truly valuable. The people who live in it, in all their diversity." I accepted his apology with cautious optimism. The interim board's term was ending and elections for a permanent board were scheduled. Given my role in the community's transformation, several neighbors had encouraged me to run. I was gardening with Ethan when a familiar voice interrupted our peaceful afternoon. "Diana, do you have a moment?" Diane Whitfield stood at our garden gate, looking smaller somehow without her position of authority. Next to her was Margaret Peterson, the former treasurer. "What can I do for you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral for Ethan's sake. "We understand you're considering running for the HOA board," Diane said, getting straight to the point. "I'm thinking about it," I confirmed, waiting to see where this was going. "We'd like to endorse you," Margaret spoke up, surprising me. "The community respects you, even those of us who disagreed with you before." Diane nodded. "You stood up for what you believed in for your family. That shows character and commitment to the community." I couldn't help but laugh, though there was little humor in it. You tried to fine me $10,000 and nearly got us evicted. Now you want to endorse me for the board? We were wrong, Diane admitted, the words clearly difficult for her to say. I was wrong. I've had a lot of time to reflect on my actions as board president, and I regret many of the decisions I made, including targeting my son's therapy garden. Especially that, she said quietly. My grandson was recently diagnosed with ADHD. Watching my daughter struggle to find accommodations for him has been illuminating. I understand now what you were fighting for. I studied their faces, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. Instead, I saw what appeared to be genuine remorse, and perhaps a desire for redemption. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, whispering loudly, Mom, are these the mean ladies who didn't like my garden? Diane flinched visibly at his words. They are, I answered honestly. But they're saying they're sorry now, and that they understand why your garden is important. Ethan considered this with the straightforward logic of childhood. Everyone makes mistakes, he said finally. That's what you always tell me. Out of the mouths of babes. I'll consider your endorsement, I told them, but I need to be clear about something. If I run, and if I'm elected, my priority will be ensuring that this community is inclusive and accessible to everyone. That means reasonable accommodations without a fight. That means diversity in all its forms being welcomed, not just tolerated. We understand, Margaret said. That's actually why we want to support you. The community needs that vision. As they turned to leave, Diane paused. Oh, and Diana, Benjamin asked us to give you this. She handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a comprehensive report on every property in Oakridge Estates, documenting violations that the previous board had selectively enforced or ignored entirely. Properties belonging to board members and their friends had pages of overlooked issues, while homes belonging to minorities, single parents, and families with special needs had been targeted for minor infractions. He said you'd know what to do with it, Diane added, a hint of her old stiffness returning. Though I hope you'll be more merciful than we were. I was elected to the HOA board the following month along with a diverse slate of neighbors who shared our vision for a more inclusive community. My first official act was to propose a complete amnesty for all outstanding violations, allowing everyone to start fresh under the new bylaws. The motion passed unanimously. As for the damning report Benjamin had provided, I didn't need it anymore. The community was moving forward, not looking for retribution. I shredded it during our first neighborhood block party, an event that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. The sensory garden that started it all has become something of a local landmark. Families from across the city bring their children to visit, especially those with sensory processing challenges. Ethan, now 12, has become a confident guide, proudly showing visitors his favorite features and explaining how they help him. Benjamin still owns many properties in Oakridge Estates, though he's gradually selling them to families who contribute to the community's growing diversity. He attends our block parties and community events, watching with satisfaction as his investment yields returns that can't be measured in dollars and cents. As for Mark and me, we found purpose in advocating for families facing similar battles with their HOAs. Alexandra Rivera, the lawyer who first helped us, now partners with us to provide resources and support to others fighting for reasonable accommodations. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes the home you fight for becomes more than just a place to live. It becomes a statement about the kind of community you want to create. And sometimes the garden you plant grows in ways you never anticipated, yielding fruit that nourishes not just your family, but an entire neighborhood's understanding of what it means to truly belong.